Here is a question that most people are too afraid to answer honestly. How many decisions have you made this week that were driven by fear of what someone else would think? How many times did you stay quiet when you should have spoken? How many times did you back down because you were afraid of conflict, afraid of rejection, afraid of simply being misunderstood? Most people live their entire lives reacting. They never truly act. And the reason is not lack of intelligence. It is not lack of talent. It is emotional reactivity, the inability to pause between stimulus and response. And according to decades of research in psychology and behavioral science, this single gap, the one between what you feel and what you do, is the defining line between those who get controlled and those who do the controlling. Today, we are going to explore that gap. We are going to look at the psychology of emotional regulation, strategic thinking, and self-mastery. We are going to draw from real philosophy, from history, from neuroscience, and from the thinkers who understood human nature better than almost anyone who came before them. And by the end of this, the way you see emotion, power, and personal effectiveness will never be the same. Let us start with something that will sound provocative, but is completely supported by psychological research. Most of what you were taught about emotional expression is incomplete. You were told to be open, to be vulnerable, to lead with your heart. And in many contexts, those are healthy and valuable things. But there is another truth that rarely gets discussed. That unregulated emotion, emotion that governs your decisions without your awareness or consent, is one of the most powerful tools others can use against you. The psychologist Daniel Goleman, who popularized the concept of emotional intelligence in his landmark 1995 book, made a critical distinction that most people overlook. Emotional intelligence is not about feeling more. It is about managing what you feel so that your behavior remains deliberate, purposeful, and aligned with your long-term goals. The highest level of emotional intelligence is not emotional openness. It is emotional regulation. And here is the uncomfortable truth underneath that finding. If you have not learned to regulate your emotions, they become a signal to everyone watching you. A signal about what you want, what you fear, what you can be pushed into doing. Skilled people, whether they are negotiators, leaders, or simply perceptive individuals, read those signals, and they respond accordingly. This is not cynicism. This is observation. And the first step toward real self-mastery is seeing it clearly. Now, there is a figure from history who understood this with extraordinary depth, and whose ideas have been analyzed, debated, and studied in universities around the world for over 500 years. Niccolo Machiavelli. The Florentine diplomat, historian, and political philosopher who wrote The Prince in 1513 as a practical manual on governance, power, and human nature. It is important to understand Machiavelli correctly, because he is one of the most misquoted and misunderstood thinkers in Western history. He did not write a guide to becoming cruel or ruthless. He wrote an unflinching analysis of how power actually works, stripped of the moral cosmetics that most writers of his era applied to the subject. He wrote, in his own words, that he believed it was more effective to show the truth of things as they are rather than as they are imagined to be. That sentence alone separates him from almost every political writer who came before him. He was not interested in the ideal. He was interested in the real. And what he observed in the courts of Renaissance Italy, in the behavior of popes, princes, and military commanders was this: the individuals who maintained power and stability over time were not the ones who simply had good intentions. They were the ones who understood human nature deeply and governed their own behavior with discipline and awareness. He wrote that a ruler must know how to use both the nature of the fox and the nature of the lion. The fox recognizes traps. The lion drives away threats. One who relies only on the lion, meaning only on force and open assertion, does not understand the complexity of the situations they face. And one who relies only on the fox, meaning only on cunning and perception, lacks the strength to hold what they have gained. The integration of both is where true effectiveness lives. That framework is not just political, it is deeply personal. And it maps almost exactly onto what modern psychology calls flexible goal pursuit, the ability to adapt your approach without losing sight of your objective. So what does this mean practically? It means that emotional control is not about becoming cold or disconnected from your humanity. Psychological research is very clear on this point. Chronic emotional suppression, the act of pushing feelings down without processing them, is associated with elevated cortisol levels, weakened immune function, and poorer long-term decision-making, as documented in studies by James Gross at Stanford University, one of the world's leading researchers in emotion regulation. What we are talking about is something different: cognitive reappraisal. The ability to change how you interpret a situation so that your emotional response becomes an asset rather than a liability. When someone insults you in a professional setting, the untrained mind reacts. It either shrinks, which signals submission, or it erupts, which signals loss of control. Neither response serves you. But the person who has practiced emotional regulation can observe the provocation, assess the intention behind it, and choose their response with full awareness. That is not suppression. That is mastery. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who developed logotherapy, described this beautifully in his book Man's Search for Meaning. He wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is the power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. That space is not given to us. It must be trained, and expanding it is the foundation of every other psychological skill we are going to discuss today. Now let us talk about perception, because this is where self-mastery becomes strategically powerful. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who ruled from 161 to 180 AD and is considered one of the greatest practitioners of Stoic philosophy, wrote in his private journals, later published as the Meditations, that the first rule of personal power is to understand what is in your control and what is not. He wrote that you have power over your mind and not outside events. The realization of that truth is the source of strength, not weakness. This was a man leading one of the largest empires in human history, managing wars, pandemics, political conspiracies, and the constant pressure of governance. And his primary psychological tool was the discipline of perception, training himself to see events as they were, without the emotional distortion that panic, pride, or resentment creates. Stoic philosophy, which Aurelius practiced and which modern cognitive behavioral therapy was partially built upon, teaches that it is not events themselves that disturb us. It is our judgment about those events. Change the judgment, and you change the emotional experience. This is not passive acceptance. It is active recalibration. The Stoics were intensely action-oriented, but they understood that effective action requires a mind that is not driven by impulse. A mind that can observe, assess, and then move with precision. Here is where the idea of strategic awareness becomes essential. When you are governed by your immediate emotional state, you become what psychologists call reactive. Reactive behavior is predictable, and predictable behavior is exploitable. Think about how this plays out in negotiations. In a classic study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, researchers found that negotiators who expressed anger strategically, meaning deliberately rather than as an automatic emotional response, extracted significantly better outcomes than those who expressed anger reactively. The difference was not the emotion itself. It was the degree of conscious control behind it. The same principle applies to influence. Sun Tzu, the Chinese military strategist whose treatise The Art of War has been studied by military leaders, business executives, and psychologists for over 2,000 years, wrote that the supreme art of strategy is to subdue the enemy without fighting. His entire framework was built on information, patience, and the disciplined management of one's own reactions in the face of provocation. He understood something that modern behavioral science has confirmed. Reactive people telegraph their strategies. They reveal their priorities through what upsets them, what excites them, and what they cannot resist responding to. The strategically self-aware person learns to manage those signals, not to become a machine, but to become someone who chooses when and how to reveal themselves. Let us now talk about silence and stillness, because this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of personal power. There is a cultural assumption that confident, powerful people are always vocal and assertive. Research suggests the opposite is often true. In a study published in Psychological Science, participants who spoke less in group settings were frequently perceived as more powerful and competent than those who spoke most. The mechanism behind this is what researchers call conversational control. The person who listens more and speaks less gathers more information, makes fewer unforced errors, and chooses their contributions with greater precision. Machiavelli observed this same dynamic in the courts of Florence and Rome. He wrote that the wise man does at once what the fool does eventually. The fool announces his intentions before he acts. He seeks validation, seeks agreement, seeks permission. The wise man assesses, prepares, and moves. And by the time others have understood what has happened, the outcome is already established. This is not deception for its own sake. It is the recognition that strategic restraint, knowing when not to speak, when not to react, and when not to move, is a form of discipline that compounds over time. Every time you choose not to respond to provocation, you are exercising a psychological muscle. Every time you choose observation over reaction, you are training your nervous system to remain regulated under pressure. Now, a critical distinction, because everything we have discussed so far could be misread. Emotional mastery is not emotional absence. It is not about becoming indifferent to others, detached from your values, or disconnected from the relationships that matter to you. Research in positive psychology, led by figures like Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, consistently shows that meaningful relationships, empathy, and genuine connection are among the strongest predictors of long-term psychological well-being and effective leadership. What we are describing is the ability to hold both, to feel deeply and still act deliberately, to care genuinely and still think strategically, to be emotionally present in your personal life and emotionally regulated in your professional and strategic life. The psychologist Robert Greene, who spent decades studying historical figures and the patterns of power and influence in his book The 48 Laws of Power and Later Mastery, made this point consistently. The most effective people in history were not emotionally absent. They were emotionally disciplined. They felt things intensely but refused to let those feelings drive their decisions in the moments that mattered most. That is the skill, not absence. Discipline. So how do you actually build this? The first practice is mindfulness-based attention training. Research by John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts Medical School has shown that regular mindfulness practice physically changes the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for emotional regulation, long-term planning, and impulse control. Even 10 to 15 minutes per day of focused attention practice creates measurable changes within 8 weeks. The second practice is what CBT practitioners call cognitive diffusion. Learning to observe your thoughts and feelings without automatically identifying with them. The emotion is not you. It is a signal passing through you. You can acknowledge it, extract the information it contains, and still choose your behavior independently of it. The third practice is strategic journaling. Marcus Aurelius did this every single day. Writing down your observations, your reactions, and your chosen responses forces the kind of reflective processing that transforms reactive patterns into conscious ones. The act of writing about an emotional experience activates the same prefrontal cortex regions involved in regulation, which is why journaling has been shown in multiple clinical studies to reduce psychological distress and improve decision-making clarity. The fourth practice is delayed response training. When you feel the urge to react, impose a deliberate pause. In negotiation settings, this is called the strategic pause. In psychology, it is called response delay. Even a few seconds of conscious delay between stimulus and response can completely change the nature of the action that follows. Let us bring this full circle. Machiavelli wrote something in The Prince that has been quoted endlessly, but rarely understood fully. He described the ideal ruler as someone who could appear to have all of the virtues without being constrained by any of them in moments where the situation required something else. This has been interpreted as a license for cynical manipulation. But the deeper reading is more interesting. What Machiavelli was describing is role flexibility, the ability to adapt your presentation and your approach to the demands of the situation without losing your internal clarity about your goals and values. This is not hypocrisy. It is contextual intelligence, and modern organizational psychology has a name for it: high self-monitoring. Research by Mark Snyder at the University of Minnesota showed that high self-monitors, people who are skilled at reading social situations and adjusting their behavior accordingly, achieve significantly higher career outcomes and leadership effectiveness than low self-monitors, who tend to behave the same way regardless of context. The key is that this flexibility is driven not by anxiety or the need for external approval, but by clear internal purpose. You know who you are and what you are building. That clarity allows you to move fluidly across different contexts without losing yourself in any of them. Here is what this all looks like integrated together. The person who has mastered emotional regulation does not need to announce their presence. They do not need to perform confidence, because the internal state that produces confidence is already stable. They are not rattled by provocation, because they have trained the gap between stimulus and response. They do not telegraph their strategy, because they have learned the strategic value of silence and observation. They are genuinely present in their relationships, because their emotional life is not a source of chaos but a source of data. And they move with deliberate intention in everything they do, because they have learned the most fundamental lesson that history's most effective individuals all understood. The person who controls themselves controls their world, not through domination, not through fear, but through the kind of quiet, grounded, unshakable self-possession that makes everyone around them feel the weight of someone who cannot be moved. That is the psychology of real power, not loud, not reactive, not desperate for approval, clear, disciplined, untouchable in the best possible sense of that word. You are not here to be controlled by every passing feeling. You are here to become the person who chooses, deliberately and consciously, who they are in every situation. That is not the end of your emotional life. It is the beginning of your real one.